everybody. I'm gonna put me on.
You ready for me to stop sharing?
Well, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Then I'll have my face be shown first here. We have 35 people joining us already. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. My name is Tracy Heilers. I'm founder and executive director of Coalition of Schools Educating Mindfully. Sometimes we call it COSEM to help our voices. We've started, with the help of our wonderful president, Tovi Scruggs-Hussein, regular monthly equity-based conversation series. So very important topics that we can all get up to speed on with the help of Tovi and some special guests. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass it over to Tovi and she'll introduce our special guests. But actually I want to just kind of say how we'll, the format will happen for our webinar. So we have Q&A available if you, as you're listening to Tovi or Nicole, if you have a question, you can type it in that way. Otherwise, after Nicole finishes her short, their short discussion, you can also click raise your hand, and then we won't see a video of you, but instead of asking a question by the Q&A and typing it in, we'll hear your voice ask the question, and it can be more conversational. So I will give precedence to those people who are brave and raise their hand, and we'll try to do it that way as well. So if you haven't yet, in the chat box, click chat, and please introduce yourself with your name, your school or organization, where it is, what city, state, or country, and anything else you want to share. And then at the very end, we'll say goodbye to Tovi and Nicole, and then you can ask me any questions if you have a specific question about COSEM, anything like that that's not webinar related. All right, so go ahead, Tovi, lead us off with a mindful minute and introducing Nicole.
Wonderful. So let's just take a moment in proper COSEM fashion that we practice what we preach. So let us just close our eyes for a moment. Maybe take 3 deep breaths. And just honoring this moment of stillness. And maybe bringing a slight smile to our faces as we think of something or someone that we are grateful for. I'm going to lightly ring the bell. When you can no longer hear the bell, please come back fully present. All right, we've got so many great folks joining us from Minnesota, from Illinois, wow, Texas, Wales. Did someone say Wales? Someone said Wales. Fabulous. This is getting more and more exciting every moment. And so we're welcoming all of you. We're thrilled to have you from all over the nation and the country as you are a part of the COSEM Equity Series Conversations. And because our emotions are so real, our conversations are too. So we really keep it real here in our equity work and our conversations.
Sorry about that.
And with us today is an esteemed educator who is also international and nationally recognized. Nicole, she'll shake her head, know what she is. Nicole Lusiani Elliott. I did not print out her bio, which is so wild, and I took for granted. I've known her for over 25 years. We started teaching together when we were 22 years old. And Nicole is the assistant director for the Center for Culturally Responsive Teaching and Learning, affectionately called the Shiraki Center, I would like to think in some ways. And Nicole is just truly a master teacher. And she not only is a master teacher, she has been doing her own equity work and racial healing work since her teaching career began as well. So she's definitely been an ally to me and an accomplice and an anti-racist. And so she's going to be bringing some of that sharing into our conversation today. And what also is super just impressed me, I was actually a principal for Nicole. I was her principal for a little while. And she would be using these practices in advanced placement courses. Like, she made advanced placement culturally and responsibly relevant. And you don't hear about those kinds of things happening. And we often don't marry those two things. So again, I don't want to keep talking too long because she's amazing. We have her for the short amount of time. And so welcome, Nicole. Welcome to our community. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't want to take credit where credit's not due. I'm actually not the assistant director of the Scruggs-Hussein Center. I consider myself more chief thought partner. But I am an assistant director at the center I work for at Stanford. So I think I just want to make sure that I'm not.
Good to clarify those things.
No, yeah.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry for getting it wrong. And yes, she also is at Stanford, right? Because that just makes total sense. So, so thank you for that. And let's just jump in. You know, I know that you practice mindfulness in some ways, and I always encourage people, and we in COSEM encourage people to find the practice that works for them, and whatever they're doing that works for them is what really works. And I love that you contributed to the free ebook around creating sacred spaces for mindfulness to happen. And so for those of you who have that free ebook, Nicole's picture is the one with the beautiful statue in the yard. And so again, all these alternative places for how we can practice who we are and keep our work near and dear. So what does your mindfulness practice look like?
You know, I wish I could say it came out of some sort of evolved consciousness. It actually came out of a real need, because I'm somebody who struggles with anxiety. And when you have two small babies at home and 200 kids at school, there has to be a way to interrupt that kind of anxiety response. And I found that quiet meditation, and I say that loosely because I think some people think meditation is like this really scary or specific thing, but really it's just, for me, a matter of like, let me just be in quiet, in silence, and in solitude, and practicing being attentive to the voices in my head, and who those voices are and what they're saying, and how I can interrupt them sometimes, and really just practice attending to different things besides the noise in my head. So yeah, for me, it came on as a bit of a survival tool to navigate teaching in our school that was full of kids who are extraordinary and have extraordinary needs to match, and then being able to parent my own children at the same time.
Absolutely. And you're hitting on what is so key for teachers now, and always has been, and for kids now. And that's really the importance of how we're cultivating our resilience and how we're taking care of ourselves. And I've really enjoyed that about our friendship and our professional relationship, and how we were able to support others in doing that, but also learning to do that for ourselves. And I know I talk a lot about that for our own wellness, particularly as people who lead for equity. But what kind of connections can you help folks make, maybe even particularly white folks? What can they make around this intentional self-care piece? If they're going to be anti-racist, if they're going to be racial healing allies, what do they need to do to take care of themselves?
Well, it's interesting because I feel like this whole notion of self-care and grace has to be matched with accountability, particularly for folks who are white. I always say God gave us two hands so we could hold two truths at the same time. And for me, accountability and grace are those two truths in this space. In recent months, I've joined a white accountability group just to kind of unpack, you know, so much of what happens in our schools is really seeped in white culture and white supremacy in particular, but it's so embedded in the norms of a school that we don't interrogate it. We just see it as normal, right, or regular or right. And I think this notion of accountability and grace needs to be held together because, yes, we do need to recognize that as teachers in today's schools, particularly in schools that have significant need and are under-resourced, there's a lot of trauma happening, secondary trauma, and, I don't know what the word is, first degree trauma for teachers. And I think if we don't give ourselves some space for self-care and mindfulness, we can't hold ourselves accountable, which is the other half of the really important piece. I mean, I think about back to our days in our young 20s when San Lorenzo was reckoning with its own issues around race and not properly serving our kids or all of our teachers. And we had these diversity days, remember? Mm-hmm. That were extraordinary. And when I think about this was 1996 or 95, right? Way ahead of the curve in some ways. I'm super embarrassed about the space that I took up in those days, that my tears of like fragility, and at the same time, I have to recognize like I was where I was and I didn't stay there, which, for somebody with anxiety, you either overperform or you underperform. And I'm an overperformer. And so I can't stop thinking about stuff if something's particularly moved me. And I quickly recognized my behavior as being essentially kind of in this place of white savior. Most of our kids were kids of color, and I was this white woman among many white women, and very few teachers of color who were my colleagues to hold up a mirror and say, our kids don't need saving. So that's bullshit, right? Like, so I needed to take some time to really unpack that. And I do give myself grace that I needed the space. And I also am grateful that, that as I said, I continued that work. But I think for me, we're just further down the road, right? We're having the same conversations we did in 1995 and 2020 now. And we have to recognize that we're all kind of on-ramping into this work in different places. But the point is we have to on-ramp. We can't make excuses any further. And for me, part of the way you get on the on-ramp is that you interrupt that trigger response, right? Just like I was saying before about how, because of my anxiety, I needed to learn how to be mindful and how to sit in silence and solitude to interrupt the anxiety response kind of knee-jerk reaction or trigger. I think that we have to do the same thing with our practices as racial allies. We need to find that place where we can push the pause button. And instead of getting defensive, or instead of getting reactive, or instead of recognizing behavior as cultural as opposed to wrong, we need to have that thing in place where we can pause and say, let me interrogate this for a minute, and really with both my hands, my grace hand and my accountability hand, consider my impact here. I think a lot of well-meaning white folks, particularly white women that are so predominant in the education field, we don't mean to be hurtful, right? But what we don't recognize is that our intention isn't doing the hurt, our impact is doing the hurt. And we need to be able to really sit back from that and recognize our responsibility, and then take steps to make a shift.
It's really well said, and just thank you for your vulnerability and transparency in that. I'm really sitting with, I was where I was, but I'm not there anymore. Like, that's just a beautiful statement as well. And I think is, we're always teachers, and we always talk about how we're teachers at our core, and every moment is a teachable moment. And I just am, really sitting in appreciation for listening to you articulate in this way, which I haven't done in probably several years. But, I remember back in those 90s and those days, and just to hear the beauty of the growth and the ownership. And that's the accountability aspect, I think, that you're naming. I'm not saying that like I need a stamp of approval. I'm just naming it to say that like I'm in that appreciation of that journey. As we always talk about the importance of this equity work being a journey, your sharing is an articulation of how that journey manifests, how that journey shows up, when you can get to that place of grace and accountability. And it sounds like you're naming like self-compassion in there as well as it's spilled over for others, but you're giving yourself permission for it to be embodied by you as well. And even one of the comments, and then I'll be quiet again. One of the comments even says like reflection goes a long way, and it totally does. I mean, I'm just sitting in awe of your reflection, and it's just lovely.
Well, I really appreciate that. And you're one of my best and dearest friends, and I could start weeping at your kindness right now. But the truth is, like, it has to also come in the form of urgency, right? I read this really powerful piece white folks in their book clubs, right? And I forget what the title was. I think it was in the Washington Post. And I'm running a book club right now, having these conversations. And I feel like I'm coming to this notion of both and, right? Like, I can deeply recognize my privilege to engage folks in a book club to talk intellectually about things that are this reckoning going on in our world right now. Finally, I trust we're at this tipping point where we can really reckon with some of the things that we need to reckon with as a nation. And we can see it as white folks as our responsibility, not something to empathize, but to dismantle, right? So this is kind of where my brain is. And I can hold the fact that we do need to engage intellectually, and I can also hold the fact that our work can't stop there. And it has to have a sense of urgency to it. And really it's, I am reflective by nature, but I've also had extraordinary teachers and humans in my life, you among them, Shraki among them, my friend Lydia, Sharon, all of these people I could name who gave me this space to reflect, right? And to make mistakes and to say, God, you really screwed up there, sister, but, come on, grab my hand, let's keep it moving, right? And I think that's the grace that's so important as well, that I'm so grateful for, that I did have the space to reflect and to make a shift. And thankfully, I know we're going to get to this conversation about CLR here in a minute. Shiraki Holly was invaluable in that shift for me and many others who have come to work for him and be devoted kind of to this notion of how do we sustain the identities, the cultural and linguistic identities of our kids. And I think there's something to having something super tangible and language for things that we maybe know in our hearts but don't know how to do or what to do with that. To be able to say, oh, look, here are the things that I did that I didn't know I was doing. Mm-hmm. And here's some ways that I can start to interrupt that. And it's not, the handshakes and the music playing and all of that fun stuff to make a culturally responsive environment. That's like 5% of really, when we talk about culturally sustaining pedagogy, we're really talking about instruction. Yes. And when we talk about instruction, we have to kind of backpedal to think about planning. And when we think about planning, we have to backpedal and think about mindset, right? And when we think about mindset, we have to take a step back and think about mindfulness. And so to me, this is all, I've had the great fortune of doing this extraordinary thing we call teaching for so many years. And it's spiritual practice. Like, to me, the book that I want to write is that teaching is a spiritual practice, because how many of our kids, the kids that we wish were absent because they drive us insane, right? Like, these are our spiritual teachers, and having the orientation toward mindfulness allows me to pause and say, okay, this kid is not trying to make me insane. The universe has put this child in my place to teach me something. So what is that thing? And without mindfulness, you can't do that. So.
Absolutely. That's so wonderfully and beautifully said. That's why she's my best friend, y'all. Someone said in the comments, write that book. And then someone else, Kat, I think Nicole pretty much answered your question, and she's going to answer it even more as she takes us through this mini lesson. So we're going to segue into hearing your thoughts on the connection between CLR and SEL, and how the framework presents. And from your presentation, we'll just move into the Q&A.
Okay. Okay, so I'll share my screen here. may have just, oh shoot, let me stop my share here for a second. Sorry, I
No
think I
worries.
just quit exactly what I needed.
And someone is commenting in the comments that she has used SEL activities in her teaching this year and has noticed a swift in the classroom dynamic.
Mm.
So a nice swift change in the dynamic of the classroom.
I'm really glad that this guest said that, because it reminds me of, you know, last month when Shiraki and you were talking about SEL in the classrooms, I just want to kind of hold up something he said, and how sometimes teachers can unknowingly use SEL as a weapon against our kids and make it their responsibility. Like, if you would just learn to meditate, you could be cool, you know, like that kind of, we can't use it in that way. And I have a couple of colleagues actually on the call, I'm seeing their names come up, Deanna and Jennifer, who are thinking really in interesting ways about how SEL and what we call CLR, cultural and linguistic responsiveness, can marry in the classroom. And I think SEL, I know it has a place in our classroom, and we're seeing from our guest here that it was a game changer. I think for me, my kind of take is we need to think about SEL for ourselves as educators. Mm-hmm. I need to get better at social and emotional learning in order to be a better teacher and be more responsive to our kids. And so when I think about the interplay between the two, for me, and maybe my thinking will evolve over time, but for me, it really is about the teacher and what the teacher needs to do to get clear about her work before we can enter into this space to asking our kids to do it. You know, we're the leaders of our classroom, and we need to go first. That's my strong contention.
Absolutely.
So I'll share, you know, a couple of slides here and some thoughts, particularly about CLR. Shiraki started the conversation with the kind of what it is last month. Mm-hmm. And this is our typical pattern. Well, he'll go in and do the big picture, and then I'll come in behind and then teach teachers how to do the lessons. So we'll just do a quick little mini lesson on that here, and then maybe we can take questions. I want to note before we start that this is normally, you know, a 5-day institute, and we're doing it here in a quick little overview. So I'm not going to do it justice. There's extraordinary intellectuals behind all of this work, Shiraki being one of many, but what we all have in common is this idea that every child will have some aspect of one or more of their cultural and linguistic identities validated and affirmed by seeing themselves in what they learn and or how they learn it each and every day. Every child deserves to see themselves. And it's a crime that I would say most of our kids don't see themselves, particularly in schools that are under-resourced and where our kids are underserved. And part of that is because we don't, again, take the pause to interrupt our thinking about why do we have kids sit in rows? Why do we have this kind of factory model of education that was started in the industrial era that has not evolved as our society has evolved? Thinking about things like that, but also in thinking about who are the stories that are always told and whose are the stories who are never told. And what kind of learner always thrives in the classroom and what kind of learner never thrives in the classroom. So these are the things we need to be thinking about that from my perspective, we can only interrupt our own narrative and pause to consider if we've got the place of mindfulness to do that. Our work at the center really focuses on the notion of intersecting identities, and that we're not one thing, right? Like I often speak in my work that I was raised in a traditional Italian home, Italian-American home, I should say, because I think people in Italy may not think me a traditional Italian. I was raised Catholic. I was raised, you know, in the 70s. Like, I'm not one thing, but I'm kind of an amalgamation of all of those things. And we really look to kind of tease out the identities of our kids and really think about how we can honor each one in different ways through our curriculum and through our instruction most pointedly. And we come from the place that cultural and linguistic misunderstandings just simply hurt our kids. When the teacher and the student don't understand each other culturally or linguistically, we end up with disproportionate student discipline, which is something we've been talking about since, I don't know, like the beginning of time. Things that we don't talk about are students who are highly resilient, like they can do school, they can abandon themselves at the school door and become the student that the teachers want them to become, but they edit themselves so much that it leaves them like in imposter syndrome or feeling inadequate or inauthentic, in some sort of conscious or unconscious pain, right? We see these kids these are like the roses in the concrete, who can thrive under the worst of circumstances, but what's the cost for our kids? The third thing is I think that students who feel less sure of their identities, who maybe weren't raised or are in circumstances where they're constantly having those identities reflected back as negative, that they tend to shut down or opt out altogether. And sometimes we see that as the trauma that they're bringing into school, and often that's related. But what we don't often talk about is the trauma that school does to them. As a result of these misunderstandings and other things. So this is kind of the why. And then I would also say that each of these rings, the way we do our work is we think about each of these rings holding its own language, right? So language isn't necessarily a ring that's separate, because you know the way that people speak, generally what generation they're in, right? You know the way that people, what they value, generally what their nation of origin is, or at least the region that they're from. You can kind of pick people out sometimes. And so what we want to do is we want to think about our kids as all of these things and more. Like, for example, there's a lot of folks on the call from the Midwest. Hockey culture in the Midwest is like for real. It's something I never would have known had I not done work there, right? Mm-hmm. Ability culture is something that we can talk about here. Regional culture, like there's all sorts, these are just examples of things that we can think about when we interrogate school culture and how that may or may not be reflected in the culture of home. At the center, we focus on, we've taken a look at this idea of deep culture, right? Oftentimes like multicultural day, where the food comes and like, listen, lumpia is great. And clothes and garb and artifacts are beautiful. But this isn't what's getting in the way of in creating these misunderstandings, right? What's getting in the way are these kind of 16, I think they're 16 anthropological behaviors that we've identified that really interrupt a child's ability to kind of flow as themselves in the classroom. And these are the things under the leaves. They're the things that we would see as like the trunk, proximity, eye contact, kinesthetic orientation, and then even things below. The notion of like concept of time. I mean, my God, how many times are we going to talk about the tardy policy, right? And that's not to say that we don't have bells or we don't have hard start times, but how can we honor kids who come from families who have a more relative time orientation? How do we infuse that into our instruction in addition to the precise time orientation? Things like direct communication, right? I remember one of my girls said to me, "Why are you wearing that dress? It's not cute." And I said to her, "Wait, are you insulting me, or are you saying that because you love me?" Right? And she said, "Well, it's because I love you. If I didn't love you, I wouldn't tell you that." But if I didn't have that pause button, like that's when kids get sent out. And really all she's saying is, "I love you and you're not living up to your best self. Are you okay?" And I need to be able to understand that form of communication. And all of this, I guess I say, I'm not saying that if a kid says F you, mother effer, that's cultural, right? This is not about not having boundaries. It's about recognizing the difference between what's baked into the culture of school and how that may or may not be reflected with our kids. This is something that I like teachers to usually consider, is this idea of what cultural behaviors are made an asset at school and what cultural behaviors are made liability by the culture of school. And what we can generally see is the kids whose families have a cultural or linguistic orientation that matches the culture of school, it's like those kids come. That's the whole invisible knapsack, right? That Peggy McIntosh wrote about so long ago, is that their home is like this. They've learned how to be this. This is what they value. And it just happens to match the culture of school. And so when we think about really creating a vibrant, responsive classroom that sustains our kids in a multitude of cultural and linguistic ways, we have to incorporate both of these lists. It's not just one or the other. And the idea is we design instruction and we make choices about our instructional design that juxtapose these things. And so this is kind of the crux of our work at the Center for Culturally Responsive Teaching and Learning, is this idea that we have to widen our pedagogical design to incorporate all these different kinds of behaviors so that every child feels like, yeah, I belong here. This is my place. And also every child feels like, ooh, I'm going to learn some new things here and stretch and grow my repertoires of learning. And I feel like it's also important to note, like, kids who come to school, who know how to do school because that's how their families are, these are the kids that are going into the workplace. And the workplace is saying, what the hell? They're not resilient. They don't take initiative. They don't have social skills. We've done that to them in school. And so it's not just about let's let our underserved learners thrive. It's also about let's let the kids who know how to do school also know how to do life, right? We're globalizing our approach to learning in the classroom. And most of our work is focused on instructional choices. As I mentioned before, and some of them are also, we're starting to think harder about curriculum choices, particularly like my field of study is history and social studies. And we need to do a much better job thinking about how to better reflect our kids in those stories. And then the third thing is here, choices in how we respond. That's what I was mentioning earlier about, like, let's pause the trigger response and really allow ourselves to interrogate what Shraki says, our first thought is not our last thought, right? We're humans, we're wired for biased thinking. The difference between a good person who's wired for biased thinking and a good person who is going to be culturally sustaining for their kids is the ability to push the pause button and to really think to myself, is this wrong or is this cultural? And sometimes it's wrong, right? The end. And sometimes it's just different from me and I need to honor that child. I always tell this story about, I had this child who I used to say would blurt, like I was in the middle of a lecture and they'd be like, oh, my cousin, blah, 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 blah. And I adored this boy, but he was driving me crazy. And instead of saying to myself, oh, this is a cultural behavior, I said to myself, this is wrong. He keeps interrupting me, right? And it wasn't until I did my work, in part with his mother, who gave me some real learnings about where that was coming from. And just like that girl who told me my dress wasn't cute, this was a boy who was saying, I'm vibing with you. You're telling a story that's making me think about my cousin. I love this story. And what I needed to say was, I love that you're vibing with me right now. Just give me a minute and then you can tell me all about your cousin. And instead I said, would you sit down and be quiet till I'm done, right? And I killed it. I killed the child's enthusiasm for learning. And so I guess I offer this whole thing as it's choices in how we teach, it's choices in what we teach, and then it's choices in how we respond to our kids. And the idea is we're always toggling. Shiraki talks about this balance between validating and affirming who the child is and building and bridging them to a different way of being. Sometimes that building and bridging is to the culture of school, but if they come from the culture of school, then we validate and affirm that, and we build and bridge them to the culture of what I would say is more like the real world. So it's this constant toggling that we design our instruction accordingly. So, I mean, I guess I could go on and on, but I don't need to hear myself talk anymore. If we wanted to see if there's any questions or any exploration that wants to be done, I'll stop there.
That was really fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. And I know it's resonating with folks. We can definitely open it up for some Q&A.
Yeah, start typing in
Yeah.
your questions in the Q&A. We can just take a pause here ourselves, a sacred pause, just let that sink in, and then maybe a question will arise as well.
I really want to pick up Bryn's question about is under-resourced coded language. It is, right? And I appreciate the push on that. I think the fact of the matter is, when I say under-resourced schools, I am talking about schools who are under-resourced, but what I'm not saying, and what I appreciate the push on, is that these schools are filled with our kids who are Black and brown, and that's predictable and pervasive. And so I appreciate the push on that.
Nicole, can you repeat after predictable and pervasive, because it broke up a little bit?
Yeah, I was just noting that I guess it speaks to the larger issue of, we often don't say the whole picture, right? We'll say under-resourced because the school is under-resourced. So for example, my son's school, when they don't get the funding they need, they rally the families, and we're in a position to be able to support and make up for that funding. Schools that are under-resourced maybe don't have that kind of community base financially, but really more to the point, the predictable piece of all of it is that these are schools that are filled with our students who are Black and brown and immigrant, and maybe not coming to school with standardized English. And so I'm just noting here my appreciation for the push to tell the whole piece, not just the label.
Someone's asking if the slides will be available.
Sure. I don't know how you want to make them available, but I'm happy to share.
Okay, thank you. You can just email them to me and I'll get them to Tracy. She'll get them on the website.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
And you don't feel compelled to that. If there's anything that's not, just okay.
I'll just check with Shraki to make sure that he's okay with that. But most of what I shared is available actually on the website, culturallyresponsive.org, I think, org. If somebody could look that up. I know there's folks in the audience who are who I work with, and maybe put it in the chat, the website. There's a bunch of resources there that can be drawn on, far more than I offered today.
Great. If people wanted to learn more, I mean, I know they could go to the website, but what does a typical workshop look like when working with you? I know there's a 5-day institute, but what if someone's like, I don't have 5 days, I have a half day or a day?
Well, for this particular work, the workshops would be with Shraki, and then one of us will come in and do what's called a jump start, which is basically let's gather the teachers who are going to be coached, and let's think about how to be really intentional and plan with this framework that we offer. And then we go in from there and we do instructional coaching. We're starting to explore what that looks like in a virtual space. COVID kind of pushed the envelope for that for us. But in truth, it's something that I think we should be thinking about anyway, particularly when we go to do work in the Midwest and we're messed up with weather and things like that. So that's one way. Another way is we have summer institutes. Oh, and I see Jennifer actually just wrote this down. These are 4-day summer institutes. They're virtual again this summer, but usually they're in person. I don't know, maybe they'll do a hybrid or maybe both next summer. But these are basically some folks who work at our center, create this 4-day learning arc where teachers get to sit in community and learn and plan. And it's a pretty extraordinary experience from what I understand. I haven't had a chance to do that with them. And then I do work that's, most of the work that I do is related to the center work here. But, I also have kind of my own brand, particularly as it relates to history education. That's where it feels extra personal to me.
Well, can you give us like a 30-second version of that? And then I have a big question that someone wrote to make sure that you're time for.
Sure. I think really quickly it's about how do I elevate the stories that are untold. And how do I honor multiple rings of identity in the stories that I tell? Martin Luther King was an extraordinary icon in the civil rights movement. He was not the only guy there. And there were lots of women there too. And there were some gay folks there, right? And there were some young folks there. And so how do we open up the notion of whose history counts? And how are we looking at knowledge bases? And when we teach, for example, enslavement, do we spend 3 weeks on enslavement and 1 day on abolition and the end? And what story does that tell? So it's really so much about intentional choices. And I love to work with history teachers about that.
Thank you. And Nicole also had a fabulous women's history course at San Lorenzo High, and one of the few, really, I would venture to say a few in the state, very few in the state at the high school.
We were the second in the state. Berkeley High was first, and we were second. That women's studies course was extraordinary. It was life-changing for me to teach it, frankly.
Absolutely. And I just remember the girls on campus just talking about it and just the power that it was holding for them, and the stories of the Latina students and how it was just really opening up different worlds for them culturally in a lot of ways, because a lot of that pushed against some of their own upbringing. And so I had to really reckon with that. Someone wrote in the Q&A, what would you say, Nicole, to teachers who feel like they can't teach certain content because they would feel like an imposter doing it, especially to a group who better fits the cultural makeup of that content? For example, white English teachers I know hesitate to teach African American literature because they feel like they have no right, since that's not their own experience.
Yeah, this is so common. And this is what I was talking about earlier about intention versus impact. And to that, I would say grace and accountability. Yes, I understand. It's scary, particularly as, I don't have an experience as being raised by anything else other than a white woman, but there is a thing about perfectionism, and for white women, that if we can't do it perfect, we shouldn't do it at all. And I just have to call bullshit on that. Like, it's not an excuse. We have to do our own work, right? And so we enter into the learning with humility, and we enter into the learning saying, I'm going to mess up here. I don't know, but let's do this together. We recognize that we are not the only source of knowledge in the classroom. We've got 36 kids here who can help us think about and learn together. I can't tolerate or accept, well, I'm not of that culture, so I can't teach it. Now, I will say there's a real fine line around cultural appropriation that we have to be mindful of. And it's certainly one that I've stepped over unintentionally. And because I cultivated really strong relationships with my kids, they could say, that's not something you should say, right? And I could hear that, and it was true. And we have to create the relationships where our kids can say, you know what, I hear that you're trying here, but that's just not for you. And for me to not to take that personally and to really recognize it as an opportunity to learn. There's a lot of this question around, part of our work is around call and response. So if our kids are deeply engaged in learning in partner talk or group work or team, whatever, how do we get them back, right? And a lot of that can and arguably should be done with this notion of call and response, which is a highly cultural practice. And for many folks, I think how I was raised Catholic, how many, a priest says, peace be with you. And I don't even think before I say it also with you, right? This is the same kind of thing. We encounter a lot of teachers who are just shy. Like, I can't yell, like, that's not me. To them, I say, I understand. So until you can get there, how can you empower a kid to be your call and responder? How can you recognize that the way you're feeling about call and response is the way a lot of our kids feel about school, and they still show up and be brave and try to navigate this new territory. So how can you say, you guys, we're going to try to call and response today, and I'm super nervous about looking like a fool. So when I say bring it and you say back, I need you to say it hella loud because I don't want to feel dumb, right? Something, you know, like we have to be willing to try. And I think Brene Brown's work is so important here around vulnerability and courage. Our kids are so damn brave every day. They show up every day, even when all the statistics and all their experience often tells them that they don't belong, they still come. And if they can be that brave, then like, how dare I say, well, I don't know, I'm not a Black woman, I can't teach a Black book. I mean, remember our mentor, I mean, I'll just, you know, just name our mentor, Pamela Wilson, who is the whitest old white lady in the universe, jumped in the deep end and taught Beloved, right? And did it with such extraordinary grace, making all the, what a gift it gave our kids to be able to see themselves reflected back. And Beloved is such a hard book, right? Like, I don't know that I would not, I'd be afraid to teach it just because it's so damn hard to read. But she did it. And she did it with kids in this class that, not only is she the whitest of white old ladies, but this class was half kids with IEPs and half kids without. And it was like this true blended model. And it was extraordinary to watch. So I guess I say that with all due privilege that I've had some really amazing mentors to walk behind and to show me how to do that well.
Yeah. And I really want to echo that. And it's so powerful. We must have been on the same wavelength when we were getting ready for this call, because I had the memory of Pam doing that in Rose Will Bloom. It was Judy Rosenberg and Pamela Wilson. So Rosenberg and Wilson, Rose Will Bloom. And it was a hybrid class of kids with half IEPs and half kids that didn't have IEPs, which meant half special ed and half not. And it was so powerful. And what I really want to drive home here for everyone is that, again, kids know if you care and if you love them. It is so not about the color of our skin. My master teacher, my mentor teacher was this old white woman, is this old white woman, Pam. And so people are like, what do you mean, Tovi? You're so Afrocentric, and how can this be your, because she had me when I was 21, 22 years old as her student teacher, and I could tell, and all she drilled into me was, you just have to love them enough to teach them well. And it was never about the color of their skin. And she didn't make it something, she paid attention to the color of skin to help her impact and influence what she was going to do. Like, she wasn't colorblind. She was like, this is impacting and influencing my decision making. And that level of consciousness is just so needed. And for her to have that back in the 80s and into the 90s to pour that into us is just phenomenal. So 2 last questions. I'm wondering if you can kind of mix them. Maybe you can't.
Okay.
One is Peggy's asking, can you speak to the importance to using movement in the upper grades and middle school? With that question, either flow into, please, or blend how you used this material with advanced placement.
Yeah, you know, advanced placement kids talk about movement. They looked at me like I was a straight fool. Like, no, I just have to read and take my notes and take my test. Do not tell me I have to do call and response. I have to do partner talks. I have to get up and move. Just, I know how to do school, right? Kids who get to advanced placement, especially because I had advanced placement seniors when I taught Gov Econ, by and large, they know how to do school. But what I knew is that predictably, I could look across my room and see who was going to have a chance to pass that test and who was not. And I had 5 Black students in a class of 36, which was not proportional to the school population. But I said to myself, I'm not going to let these kids be unseen. I'm not going to let them feel like failures when it's really the system that's failed them. What do I need to do to think about taking this instruction and making it responsive to those 5, but also to, you know, I think I had 2 white kids in the whole room. It was very a mixed crowd. 60 or 70% of them were not English as first language. They had been redesignated fluent over the course of their time in schools. And so the richness there was extraordinary for possibility in how we use language and how we use cultural behaviors. So to Peggy's question about movement, our kids, it has basically been beaten into them by the system to sit still. I've raised 2 sons. One just graduated from high school and one's now a sophomore. And for both of them, their elementary school experience was marked by little pieces of paper that they would bring home at the end of the day, happy face or sad face. Did I do a good job at school or did I not do a good job at school? And almost always the sad faces came home. What happened, Jackson? Well, I couldn't sit still and she wouldn't let me sit still, right? And so it broke their spirit. They hated school. And it wasn't until they had this one particular teacher who raised her own sons and could say to them, do you need to run around the building? And he'd be like, yes. And he'd run and then he'd come back and she'd say, are you done or do you need one more? I need one more. Okay, I'd run and then I'd come back and then I could sit down and think straight. Our 17-year-old kids are exactly the same. It's just they've been conditioned to think that they don't need that anymore. And it's a lie. All of the brain science around movement and learning and the connection between the two, when my body is moving, my brain is more fluid and learning more and engaging, and the synapses are, I don't even know all the words, but basically they learn better when they're moving. And so what we need to do with our big kids is the same thing with our little kids. We need to allow them to move while they learn. And it's harder with big kids because I don't want to, don't make me, this sucks, right? And so what you're doing as you're encountering those things is you're just encountering years and years of conditioning. Mm-hmm. And we need to bust all that up. I know it sucks. Come on, let's go. I know it's hard. Yep, let's go. Right. Come on. And then, I mean, at San Lorenzo, I used to send my kids on walk and talks to talk about their homework that they did the night before. They'd take a lap, they'd come in, they'd sit down. All of a sudden now they could think straight and they had reviewed the homework. I didn't have to do it. So like all of these things, they're just as important for our big kids. They're just as important for our kids in advanced placement. I don't know how many times I sent my kids out to the track, to walk the track, to review for an exam, and how relieved they were when they came in, that they had released some of that energy, their brain had been warmed up and they were moving and they were ready to sit still and to do well on the test. And so with movement and with other things, discussion most notably, you know, many of our kids are sociocentric learners, particularly kids who come from families where maybe, you know, it's long and complicated, but the bottom line, and this is my history teacher hat, we study Europeans because they had written language, right? We don't study Latin American and African countries because by and large their language wasn't written. And worse, the language of African Americans in this country isn't written because they weren't allowed to write. So it's this layered thing about, well, why do we have oral history? Well, part of it is because it's a cultural behavior of our families and for generations, this kind of tradition of oral history. Part of it is we weren't allowed to write. So no, don't tell me that you can't learn my history because it wasn't written down. And so this whole idea of how do we in a history classroom or a social studies classroom really honor that notion of storytelling? How do we allow kids to say, hey, this is what I learned. Let me tell you a story about it, friend. And then engage in a sociocentric conversation around that learning. You know, I think it was scary to do an AP because the stakes felt high, right? They publish the test scores, right? And truth be told, some of the kids that I intended to serve, I served well, and some of them I didn't. And part of that is my fault, and part of that is the responsibility of the system that had gotten them 17 years through and never had been seen until then. It's a very complex and scary thing to try to untangle. But the truth of the matter is, we have to have conversations with ourselves about our intention. I want my kids to pass this test because I know that it's going to help them, you know, skip a class in college. It's going to support their ability to graduate. There's a sense of confidence, right? I want to give them all these skills that advanced placement has to offer. At the same time, I wanted them to know they're whole for the human being that they are. And I was not going to be a part of a system that told them they had to change who they are in order to be successful academically. And so that's kind of some of the decisions that I made. And I don't know if, yes, I do. They were the right decisions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Whew, thank you for gracing us with all of this greatness and wisdom that you have just learned really the hard way. And people are saying you are amazing, you are. Now, folks, is the time to just flood the chat with your accolades and your applause for Nicole for her time with us today and how outstanding she is. We are wrapping up our time together. We're just going to, again, Nicole, just thank you so much. It was just always an honor to speak with you and to learn from you. And just, yeah, it was just a nice twist on having the two-part. Thank you so much. We're going to just learn a little bit about COSEM and ways to support COSEM for a moment, and then we will wrap. Tracy will stay on the call, folks, if people want to have some open conversation in some other areas about COSEM. So I really always encourage folks to support COSEM. And before we get to that, if you've seen this slide, our next guest is Zaretta Hammond on July 13th. So it's going to be phenomenal, but Nicole's a hard act to follow. So hopefully Zaretta will get us there. So, you know, their work is truly married in so many ways. So it's really a nice series we're doing here to take us into the new school year and what that holds for us all. So please join us on July 13th. Supporting and growing the work of COSEM. It starts with us. It starts with us. How can we commit to 1% and encourage others to commit to 1%, which is really having a mindfulness practice dedicated for 10 minutes each day. 1% of 24 hours is 10 minutes. Support the book. Share and promote it, buy in bulk for your reading groups and for your schools. Please consider starting a COSEM chapter or practice group. Really powerful way to continue to get this mission and purpose of educating mindfully out into the world. We know that it matters. And there's a donate button on the website. So please just consider donating regularly and generously. And if generously is $5 a month or $10 a month, then that is generously. You get to define what that is. It's all about keeping us going. We do so much of this for free. And Tracy really is just a full-time volunteer as the co-founder and on her mission of what this is and bringing it into the world. So your donations mean a lot. They are also tax deductible. I, along with Sally and Grace, who are also two members of COSEM, are running a series called Racial Healing Allies, and we have our first series starting July 1. We're donating 20% of all registrations to COSEM. So speaking about generously, we're thrilled to do that. Registration ends this Sunday on July 21st. So if you want to be part of doing your own racial healing work, of really taking that accountability step, then that's a great way to do it, to do some unlearning and some new learning, particularly around systemic whiteness. So please join us in that mission. So again, Nicole, we are super, super thankful for you and to you for giving us your time. And the time, again, someone asked in the chat, I'm so sorry, I'm getting too much multitasking there. Zaretta will be with us at 2:30. We run these at the same time, just a different date of the month. So that'll be 2:30. But so just thank you again, Nicole.
Pacific, right?
Thank you. 2:30 Pacific, 4:30 Central. Nicole is definitely Googleable. So if you're interested in any of her work around her reading circles or affinity group work with folks and her storytelling work, Facebook, Google, the whole nine, she is easy to find and then be able to connect with her. So again, thank you. Thank you all for tuning in and joining us. Please feel free to share this video widely with folks so that they can get the deep learning as well. So thanks again, everybody, and thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy.